Hello, my good friends. Today we're going back to the Wild West to look at the best guns in Red Dead Redemption. First up, it's the Colt Single Action Army. Now, the reason it's a single action is because basically you've got to pull back on the hammer and cock it and then pull the trigger, which is kind of awkward in that, but that's the way guns were fired back then. That's why you see these guys, when they start fanning guns, they used to use their hand to pull back the hammer and then their finger to pull the trigger, and they called that fanning so they could fire faster. And the Colt Single Action Army is basically the most iconic gun in the West. It is the gun that won the West. I mean, it is the gun that you see in all the cowboy films. I mean, everyone's got this gun. It is basically, the most popular gun around. Basically, if you were a cowboy in the Wild West and you didn't have a Colt Single Action Army, you were nothing more than an asshole. Because this was the best gun around. Look at it. It looks amazing. And it's far more advanced than the old shitty Civil War guns they used to have that looked like they were, built out of metal and bits of bolts and that. This thing looks badass and that. But of course, you had to pull back the hammer to fire. And once again, that was, an early innovation that was a bit outdated as the years went by. But it was still an iconic looking gun. And it was decent too. Powerful, accurate, a decent weapon. Now, looking at it in the game, it's called the Cattleman Revolver, which is kind of a shitty generic name. And it's got okay power, decent range, a decent rate of fire, kind of crap reload speed, and, kind of a poor ammo capacity. But that's no different to any other gun out there. It holds 6 rounds, and that's all you need with a revolver, isn't it? So at the end of the day, I think it's actually a much better gun in real life than it is in the game. But it is the first gun you get, so they kind of dumbed it down a little bit, which I think is a bit shit. But let's get real. Basically, the Colt Single Action Army is the gun that won the West. It's the most iconic gun in Wild West history. I mean, if I was a cowboy, this is the kind of gun I would have, because I'm a massive hero, and this is my kind of gun. It looks cool, and it's, badass, and it is the gun that won the goddamn West. You can't get better than that, can you, boy? Next up, it's the highly experimental LeMat revolver. I mean, when I first saw this weapon, I thought, is this actually a real gun? Because it doesn't just have one barrel, it's got 2 barrels. You've got a normal barrel that fires normal rounds, but you've got an under barrel that is used as a shotgun. It actually fires a shotgun shell, so you've got 2 guns in one. It's like something James Bond would have. No, it looks cool and it looks badass and you've got 2 guns in one, but there's probably a reason they didn't carry on making this. I mean, most guns today don't have 2 barrels, and that's probably for a good reason, and this is probably the reason why. Now, looking at the stats, it looks kind of impressive, and it is a distinctive looking weapon. I mean, there's nothing quite like it. You've got good power, good range. I mean, you've got a shotgun, for God's sake. But on top of that, it is a little bit experimental, and because of that, it probably wouldn't have been as practical as other guns in the Wild West. In fact, when I first used this weapon in the game, it got me killed, and I didn't like it because I fired one big shell and thought, hang on a minute, this gun only fires 1 bullet at a time. That's pretty shit. And I got shot down in no time, so I hated the gun. And then I realised, it's got like 2 barrels, which is kind of cool. Next up is the Dirty Harry looking hand cannon known as the Schofield Revolver, made by Smith & Wesson. This was probably the best gun around. If you had one of these guns, they called you the Schofield Kid. I mean, basically, it looks like a Magnum, doesn't it? It looks like, Dirty Harry's gun. It's fucking huge, and it packs a wallop, and this is the kind of gun that really was coming in at the end of the Wild West, and at these kind of powerful hand cannons, and this was a very, very popular gun when it came out, as you can see why, because it it looks pretty badass and pretty awesome. Realistically, this is the best gun in the game. The stats are great. You got good power, good range, good rate of fire, decent reload speed and ammo capacity, and the gun is impressive. And it came in towards the end of the West, which means it's far more advanced than, the Single Action Army. This is a powerful hand cannon, and it was one of the guns of the future. These are the kind of guns that were coming in, and this gun was probably the best around at the time, and it's certainly pretty impressive in the game as well. Next up, we got the double action Navy. This was the evolutionary gun that changed everything. This gun had a double action, which means when you pull the trigger, the hammer goes back automatically. So you don't have to piss about fanning your weapon anymore. And this made this weapon the most advanced weapon in the Wild West. It really was years ahead of its time. And it would be used after the West ended. I mean, this would become a very iconic weapon. The Colt double action Navy was probably the most advanced weapon in the Wild West. It was a beautiful gun, and obviously it had superiority over the old single action army. So the Colt double action Navy really was the gun of choice for most, badass outlaws. When you look at the stats, you got power, range, great rate of fire, because you don't have to cock the weapon, reload speed, ammo capacity, it's great. The Colt double action revolver was, basically the gun of the future, and it was still used years later. I mean, even General Patton had one in World War II. Next we have the semi-automatic pistol, and as you can clearly see, this is probably one of the first attempts to make a semi-automatic pistol, and it looks terribly clunky, and it probably wouldn't be very good if you wanted to be quick on the draw. But it was actually based on a real-life weapon called the C93, which was, like I said, an experimental clunky gun. I mean, when you look at it, it looks really kind of like it's just been manufactured in a shed. It doesn't look right. I mean, they haven't got the design right, but, the stats are pretty impressive because it was a semi-automatic pistol. I mean, you got decent power, good range, you got excellent rate of fire, obviously, and good reload speed and a decent ammo capacity. So, even though it looks like a pile of junk, it's actually, a decent firearm, although it is pretty clunky and pretty quirky to look at it. Call me crazy, but I prefer the classic-looking revolvers in the Wild West, not these futuristic-looking odd pieces of crap. So next up we got the broom-handled Mauser. Now the thing about Red Dead Redemption is it's not set in the glory days of the West, it's set at the end of the West. I mean, the first game I think it's set in like 1911, which is really at the end of the West. So you get guns like this. And this was made by the Germans and it was used in World War I. And it's called the broom-handled Mauser, mainly because it's got a handle a bit like a broom handle. That's why it was called the broom-handled Mauser. Now, in World War I, Germany had allies in Mexico, so they shipped a lot of their guns to the Mexicans, and the Mexicans had guns like this. So these kind of broom-handled Mauser guns appeared in the Wild West. And obviously, they're pretty awesome. They've got a great rate of fire, very fast, a good reload speed, excellent ammo capacity. I mean, you're talking like 15 rounds. But it does look like, a big brick, doesn't it? It's not exactly an elegant-looking gun. It does look like, like a giant big square box. In fact, I think it was called the box gun sometimes. Next up, we got the old 1899 semi-automatic pistol. I mean, Red Dead Redemption, like I said, is really at the end of the West, and this gun was coming in right at the end of the West, and it was an iconic weapon. And of course, they've kind of perfected, the slide and the design of the weapon, and it looks a lot better now, and it's a proper-looking semi-automatic pistol that we all know and love. Stat-wise, the weapon is pretty awesome. It's got great power, good range, great rate of fire, good reload speed. I mean, it's a modern pistol. It's a modern semi-automatic pistol. And in the game, they just call it the high-powered pistol, and it certainly is. I get the impression when they made these Red Dead Redemption games, they wanted to get as many cool-looking guns as possible. So they made it towards the end of the West, when the old revolvers were becoming more powerful and these new semi-automatic weapons were coming in. And as you can see, these are basically modern weapons now. We're getting to the end of the West, and really, it's the start of the 20th century. Next up, it's one of the most iconic guns, which is the Colt Single Action Navy, and it was made in 1861. These are the guns you see in the American Civil War, and they really are kind of primitive looking weapons now, but they look kind of badass. I really like the design. I mean, it looks like it's been kind of welded together with old bolts, but there's something kind of iconic about it that looks really impressive, and I really like it, and I think it's a good gun. And to be honest, I wish we had a bit more of these guns in the game. I mean, I like the gun. I like the way it looks. It's an iconic firearm, really, isn't it? It's a piece of art. Next up, we got the repeating rifles. Now, the first up is the Spencer rifle. Now, repeating rifles were used a lot more in the Wild West than they were, anywhere else in the world, because bolt-action rifles were more powerful, they were more accurate, but the fact is, the Spencer rifle was a faster rifle. You could just cock it really quickly, so it was used on the back of a horse. And these rifles were far faster than the bolt-action rifles, but they weren't quite as accurate, and they certainly weren't as powerful, but they were faster, and you could shoot multiple targets. And the Spencer repeating rifle was one of the most iconic guns of its age. Strange thing about Red Dead Redemption is they don't always call the weapons by their proper names. In fact, the Spencer rifle in the first Red Dead Redemption game was probably called like something like a shit old rifle. It didn't really have a proper name, but it was one of the best rifles. And John Marston, he says himself when he gets hold of one, he goes, "That's a pretty good weapon, ma'am." And it is. It was brilliant from the back of a horse because you could fire quick and fast at multiple targets. Of course, in the original Red Dead Redemption game, like I said, they didn't use the proper names. This gun was just called the Repeater Carbine, but it's got decent power, decent range, good rate of fire, good reload speed, good ammo capacity, and it's an all-round decent rifle. And the Spencer rifle was a bit dated at the end of the West, but it was still, a very practical weapon, although it was a real bitch to take apart and clean. That's why soldiers in World War I were all given bolt-action rifles, because these rifles were faster and quicker, but they weren't as powerful, and they were really hard to clean, and they got broke quite easily as well in the battlefield, and mud got in them, so they just weren't as effective as a bolt-action rifle, not in a world war. Next up is the iconic Henry repeating rifle. This replaced the old Spencer rifle, and this became the future. I mean, this really was a work of art. It looked brilliant, and it was powerful, and it was accurate, and it was deadly. It was superior in every way to the old Spencer rifle. And that's why the Henry rifle became so iconic in the Wild West. It was an awesome weapon, and as you look at the stats you can see why. It has everything. It's got good range, it's got good firepower. Yeah, it takes a bit longer to reload, but it's an awesome weapon. I mean, look at the power, look at the range. I mean, it's really, really one of the finest weapons in the West. If you had a Henry rifle, you were the man. Sadly, in Red Dead Redemption, you can never be the man because they changed the name to the Litchfield Repeater, which doesn't actually exist. No, that's a Henry rifle. Why have you changed the name? Why are you lying to us? That's a Henry rifle. Why are you lying to me, you bum? Next up, it's the Sharps Carbine, or more commonly known as the Buffalo Rifle. Why? Because it can bring down and kill a fucking buffalo. This is basically like a sniper rifle in the Wild West. It's got an iron sight, but it's very, 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 very powerful and can take out a buffalo with one shot. A Sharps Carbine is basically different to a repeating rifle. It's more like a one-shot sniper rifle. It's so powerful. I mean, if you shoot a guy with this, he's dead. I mean, that's what you want. You've got great power, you've got fantastic range, you've got a poor rate of fire, you've got a good reload speed and poor ammo capacity, but it's an iconic gun. Next up is the legendary Winchester repeating rifle. This was the rifle that won the West. This is the rifle that John Wayne uses. This is the ultimate weapon, and it's a great all-round rifle. Except in Red Dead Redemption 2 they call it the Lancaster rifle, which just sounds wrong. It's shit. It's not the Lancaster rifle, it's the Winchester rifle. I don't know why they changed the name, but it's an iconic weapon. When you look at it, it's got everything. It's got just a great all-round performance. It's got good power, good range, decent rate of fire, not very good at reload speed, but it's got a good ammo capacity, and it's an iconic, powerful, great all-round rifle. Next up is the double-barreled shotgun. A weapon built by the people, for the people, to kill the people. What a gun. It's iconic, isn't it? You see this gun and you think that's a badass gun. Two big barrels of death coming straight at you. When you absolutely, essentially must kill every motherfucker in the room, the double-barreled sawn-off shotgun is the only tool for you. I mean, it's just awesome, isn't it? It's just an awesome piece of firepower. Such a simple but devastating weapon. And you can't beat it. At close range, it'll blow your face off. I mean, the double-barreled sawn-off shotgun isn't really a gun at all. It's more like a piece of hand artillery. You know, that's what it is. It's like having a giant cannon in your hands and just blowing people's heads apart. Fantastic. Now, repeating rifles were faster and they were great for hitting guys, you know, quickly and hitting multiple targets. But if you wanted superior accuracy and you wanted to hit a target at range, you needed a bolt-action rifle. And that's what we got here, the Springfield bolt-action rifle. One shot, one kill. This was a proper rifle. You know, you might not be able to hit multiple targets quickly at close range, but you can kill a guy at long range with a single shot. It was a bit like a sniper rifle. It's got extraordinary power, great range. You know, not the same rate of fire as a automatic rifle, but it makes up for that with accuracy and power. A bolt-action rifle is not that effective on a horse. That's why people prefer repeating rifles. They're quicker, they're faster, you can shoot multiple targets when you're hunting. But if you want to shoot at distance and kill a man with one shot, you can't beat the bolt-action rifle. And it's much more simpler to use, and it's much more robust, and that's what makes it such an iconic weapon. You know, in the old days you had to crank everything. You had to crank a plane to get it started, you had to crank a car, you even had to crank a gun. And the Gatling gun was the ultimate machine gun because you had to wind it to fire each barrel. It was pretty impressive back then, and it was pretty much state-of-the-art technology, and it could cut down, you know, countless men. You could probably fire about 150 to 200 rounds a minute with this gun just by cranking it as fast as you can. It would have been really powerful in its day. I mean, this could have been used in the Civil War to cut down countless men. It would have been one of the most devastating weapons of mass destruction of its time. Speaking of weapons of mass destruction, it's time for the Maxim machine gun. Now, this was a German-made machine gun used in World War I, but it was also sent to Mexico because the Mexicans were German allies, and they used the weapon in the Wild West. And so eventually it found its way onto the frontier, and of course it could fire 500 rounds to 600 rounds a minute, making it absolutely devastating. I mean, it made the Gatling gun look like an outdated piece of crap. I mean, this could wipe out waves of men. And it was totally and utterly devastating. Weapons like the Maxim machine guns signalled the end of the Old West and the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, the new weapons were here, and nothing would ever be the same again. Eventually along came the pump-action shotgun or semi-auto shotgun. This was a superior weapon to the old double barrel. It had longer range, it had superior rate of fire. All you had to do was pump the weapon and fire, and at the end of the day it made a real impact in the dying days of the West. I mean, it had one long barrel, so it had better range, it had more power than the old double-barreled shotgun, and really was a devastating weapon at close range. The Winchester pump-action shotgun was simple, devastating and effective. In fact, it was such a great weapon, it's still used today by law enforcement around the world. I mean, this gun is timeless. It's effective, it's deadly, it's a great weapon.